Finding Dorothy is the story behind the epic story of The Wizard of Oz. Originally a children's book that came out in 1900 by Frank Baum. He died in 1919, 20 years before the movie. It was his wife, Maud, who Elizabeth Letts learned would go to MGM, meet Judy Garland, and watch the making of the book-turned-movie.
And the more that you look into the story, the more you discover that it was not a story that Frank made up out of nowhere. It was really, in a very profound way, the story of their life together.
Elizabeth Letts, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, I'm so excited to be here.
You know, Wizard of Oz, it's just this thing that knows no time limit.
It's so true. It seems like it's existed forever. It's really almost hard to believe that originally it was actually invented by someone.
So what is the staying power of it?
Well, I think, the Smithsonian called The Wizard of Oz America's first homegrown fairy tale. And it really, when you think about it, it's our story. It's the American story. And I think there's something so kind of quintessentially American about it. So you have the scarecrow, and the scarecrow represents, our love of our agrarian past and farming. But then you have the Tin Man, and the Tin Man is, made out of machines, and we love everything mechanical and futuristic. Mm-hmm. And you have the yellow brick road that people followed. That's our history. That's our present. Americans are people who like to go. But then we also love our homes.
I think I've heard you liken this book to when it came out, its popularity. I mean, millions and millions of copies, its sequels, millions and millions. I've heard you liken it to kind of like the Harry Potter series of its time, right?
Yes. That was what I realized when I started looking into it. So The Wizard of Oz, we know it from the movie.
Right.
But originally it was a book, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, which was published in 1900, the author Frank Baum. And it was an immediate overnight success. It was a giant phenomenon. They didn't have movies then, but there was a play. It opened in a musical play. It opened in Chicago. And then it toured the country. It went to Broadway and it went all over. And so if you were growing up in the early 20th century, you would have known the book. And then they started putting out a book a year. Every year around Christmas, the book would come out. So at the time, 1939, when they were making the movie The Wizard of Oz, they were, the people that were, adults at that time, they knew those characters and they knew that book. It was something really, really familiar to them.
Yeah, I'm sure they felt an ownership of those characters too, as you write in your book.
Just like I think that's what you see with the Harry Potter phenomenon now. Right. So yes, it was very much like that. And that surprised me. I thought that, I thought it was the film that had created it, but no, actually that mythology was already going before that. Frank Baum used to get fan mail from children by the wheelbarrow full.
Wow. Well, so that's interesting because we know a lot about J.K. Rowling and how that all started. Frank Baum, not that much.
Not that much, right? And that was really, for me, that was kind of the starting place. I didn't know anything about him. And I was reading the book aloud to my son about 6 or 7 years ago as a bedtime story. I had read it as a child. And honestly, the book didn't make such a big impression on me when I was reading it. It was the movie that I remembered. But I was reading it to my son. All of a sudden, I thought, well, it's got this whole different layer that I never, how that happens when you are reading something or see a movie and it's supposed to be for children, but then there's this whole other level. That's what happened. And that's when I realized that I didn't know anything about the author. And so I'm an author. And I thought, did he ever write another book? Who is this fellow, Frank Baum? What's the L stand for, you know? And so I looked him up. And that was how I got interested in the first place. Frank was kind of, he was a happy, handsome, imaginative person, just the person you would hope he would be, totally impractical, And so they moved and he kept trying. He was a jack of all trades and master of none. He kept trying different careers and none of them really panned out for him. He loved the arts. He loved to sing and he loved to he was in plays, he was a drama and all of that kind of thing. That was what his passion was.
And then I saw that you were interested, but you knew that it was a real book that you could write when you saw a picture. Is that right?
That's right. So one of the things I learned when I looked him up was that he dedicated the book to his wife. His wife's name was Maud. And the dedication, which I really loved, was to my good friend and comrade, my wife. And so I discovered that Maud herself was this very strong woman, very well-educated, one of the first women to attend the Ivy League. And her mother was a famous suffragist and advocate for the rights of women. So when I discovered that, I was interested in it, but it didn't say to me, Elizabeth, write a book about this. It just seemed like an interesting background. At some point later, though, that was when I found this picture. And the picture was a picture of Maud Baum. At the time, she was Frank's widow. So she was 77, 78 years old, on the set at MGM with Judy Garland. And I thought, wait a minute, there's a link between the story and the movie. And the link is his wife. And the book was dedicated to her. And that's when I became intrigued. Frank died in 1919. And now it's 20 years later. She's the last person alive who really knows the story's secrets. And the more that you look into the story, the more you discover that it was not a story that Frank made up out of nowhere. It was really, in a very profound way, the story of their life together. So it wasn't just his story, but it was her story as well. No wonder she was invested in trying to protect it.
The movie, The Wizard of Oz, the book, The Wizard of Oz, is really kind of a girl power kind of story, isn't it?
I was interested in this idea that the Baum family, and when I say the Baum family, you have Maud, and you have Frank, and you have the mother-in-law. They were all very close. Matilda Jocelyn Gage was this towering figure, a real intellectual, a close friend of Susan B. Anthony's. So much so that Susan B. Anthony would stay at their house so often that she actually carved her name in one of the upstairs windows. And their house is now a museum. Wow. And so Maud grew up with that. And, you know, when I looked into the story, you might kind of think, oh, tension, the mother-in-law, she's this.
Right.
No, they were very, very close. And it was clear that the ideas that were circulating through Maud's family, that Frank really came to embrace them as well. And when you start to look at the story, you think, okay, you know, who has the power in Oz? And that was really baked into the DNA of the story, was this very modern belief in women's equality.
Where did your research take you? Did you go to Aberdeen?
I did. I went to Aberdeen, South Dakota. And the reason that Aberdeen is important is that in the late 1880s, Frank and Maud moved to Aberdeen. At that time, it was Dakota Territory. Frank, as I said, very impractical, and it was also, I should say, though, it was a time when it was difficult for people to find a way to make a living. It was a time when the world was really rapidly industrializing. People were moving into cities and into factories. And so if you wanted to be a small businessman or something like that, it was kind of really hard to find your place. Right. So I had a lot of sympathy with that. But Frank decides he's going to move out to Aberdeen. Lots of opportunities. And it's a farming town. It's a very new farming town. So little town on the prairie, not very much around it, and just farmers around it. And so does he decide to sell, you know, overalls or like pitchforks? No. He decides that what this tiny little town needs is an emporium. And he calls it Baum's Bazaar.
Right,
and
obviously.
He fills it to the rafters with things like silver tongs and Japanese lanterns, and particularly more than 100 kinds of toys. So perhaps it wasn't the smartest business decision, but it was just a very Frank-like thing to do.
That just kind of illustrates the character that he was. Just
yes.
this.
And that's also 100% true. In Aberdeen, I was able to see the two houses that they lived in two different houses while they lived there. They're both still standing. In the library, one of the Baum descendants, it was Maud's, I believe, cousin, donated all her papers at the end of her life to the public library. And so the lovely librarian, she just ushered me into a room and started bringing me these boxes.
Wow.
And I opened them up, and it was like family photo albums, pictures of the family. And one of the things that really touched me so much, it was this little handkerchief that had been hand laced, you know, tatted by Maud. I talk about Maud taking up sewing or helping to support her family through sewing in the book. And so just to see a real artifact like that, it really meant a lot to me.
I don't want to spoil too much, but let's just suffice it to say that the evolution of a lot of those characters, that's real. That's based on fact.
Yes. So I can tell you a little bit about the witches, because I don't think this gives away too much. But Matilda Jocelyn Gage, as I said, she was a very progressive woman, and she became interested in the history of witchcraft. And she wrote a book in which she did quite a bit of research. She thought that a lot of times it was smart women who were being accused of witchcraft, and that witchcraft was basically being used to kind of keep women down and keep them in their place. And so there was a very direct tie between Matilda and her beliefs and the presence of the witches in Oz. And I'll give you a story. They're one of my favorite stories that it did make its way into the book, which is true and seems like it shouldn't be, is the story of Frank Baum and his jacket. So on the set of The Wizard of Oz, they were looking for a jacket for Frank Morgan, who played the wizard, to wear during the scenes where he was playing Professor Marvel. And they wanted kind of an old, turn-of-the-century coat that looked kind of used. So the costume manager went down to a secondhand store on Hollywood Boulevard, and she bought a rack of used coats, brought them back to the set, and Frank Morgan started trying them on until he found one that fit. It turns out that coat that fit Frank Morgan that he wears in the movie had a label inside, and the label said L. Frank Baum.
I'm so glad you brought that story up, because as I was reading the book, was it really his jacket? That was one of the notes I took.
Well, exactly.
Was that real, or did she make that up?
So I looked into it, and I'm skeptical.
Right.
And this doesn't sound like a true story. But the most definitive sources that I looked into, they all said the same thing. They said that they swore up and down that the publicist said that this was the truth, and that the two other people who vouched for it, one of them was Maude. And the other one was the tailor in Chicago. I guess there was a tailor label and said, oh, yes, indeed, we made jackets for Frank Baum. Well, so it seems like it couldn't be true. But think about this. Frank and Maude Baum lived in Hollywood from 1910 until the end of his life. And Maude still lived there when they were making the movie. I have been to that place where their house was. It is 1 block from Hollywood Boulevard. 1 block. You can walk. So it's not as improbable as it seems, but that's the kind of thing that's there. And there's this kind of, I don't know, serendipity or magic in Oz that you run into it all the time. Yeah. And it makes you so happy that it's there.
As I was reading this, I thought, I wonder what his family think about this book that you've written. And you actually had the occasion of meeting Frank and Maude's great-great-granddaughter?
Yes. I was in Ohio. I'm on a book tour right now. Yeah. And she was standing in the signing line, and she said, I want this book for my father. And then she says, I'm Frank and Maude's great-great-great-granddaughter. And then she opens a folder, and in it there's a picture of Kenneth Baum. So that's one of Frank and Maude's 4 children, the youngest. And she had a picture of him, and then she had a picture of Maude standing in front of Oscott, which was what they called their house in Hollywood. A beautiful picture that, of course, I'd never seen. I mean, I almost started bawling right in front of her. And she was as nice as could possibly be. And she was excited because she said, I don't really, it's distant enough now from her. She said she knows a few stories that she'd heard from her dad and that kind of thing, but she really didn't know. She's dying to learn the family story. So I thought that was really neat.